Okay. So, right. So last time we did one, two, three. Right. So the chapter where he says, well, there's actually a higher mode of likeness than political virtue. Political virtue, we saw it was limited, and so far it's that's a measure over something that needs to be measured. And so it has some connection with the measureless, whereas virtue exists itself by itself, or the good exists by itself by itself. And then he comes to something which is a higher mode of of likeness, which is purity or purification, right? And we saw how, even a non-philosophical or someone uncontaminated by Plato might think that there might be something more to virtue than just being like a good person. And so we saw that there's this idea of pollution already in Greek religion and life. So, for instance, you might have a member of the community, they're brave, they defend it when it's time, they're generous with other people, they're just and kind and all that. But let's say they have a past of, in the past they were criminals. And then you say, oh no, but the guy's obviously become a different person now. Nowadays they're super great. But like, yeah, but like his wealth, all the money they made that comes from crime originally, and might that not come back to punish us or to punish him, or might he not bring this? And so there's similar things in Greek religion where pollution makes you the target of evil spirits or of divine vengeance or this kind of thing. But of course, for Plato and the Phaedo and other texts, the pollution is pollution from the body, right? So you can think of someone who's very virtuous, but their virtue is all based on experience, on their big life experience, um, uh, and so they have um, again, they're just, kind, generous, brave, and all of that. They might even be wise, know what to do at each moment. But since though their whole moral knowledge is based on the experiences they've had, they're having like some overwhelming experience, some new overwhelming experience, and it's not based on on it's not grounded in their immortal souls or in reason or something like that. And since their virtue consists mostly in knowing how much to eat and when to fight and these things, they're still involved with eating, fighting, doing business with other people, and so on. And so they're exposed to all these moments where something might set them off balance or something like that. And of course they are people who fear death, right? And since they don't know, since they're not philosophers and they're not practiced in contemplating the forms, they think that death is something bad, and so they're trying to prolong their life and the life of the people they love. And they're instead of say trying to die in the way the philosopher in the Phaedo wants to die, right? Separate themselves from the body and so on. And there's the criticism that that kind of virtue is, just trading pleasures for pleasures and vice and pains for pains. So you avoid the big pain of death, and you agree to other pains or and, stuff like that. So and then Plotinus then so he takes this on board, and he gives as it were purificatory versions of each of the four virtues. Right. So, um, wisdom would be simply to engage in noesis, right? And so in insights about the forms. The temperance wouldn't be, being angry at the right moment and happy at the right moment. It would be actually not letting anger or happiness or any other bodily passion get to you at all. The bravery would not be, being able to put yourself on the line for something greater. Rather, it would be not to be afraid um, of dying at all, right? Because you just don't identify with the body. And um, and justice would be this fact that that nous, so our capacity for intellectual insight, is really the only thing that governs us, right? It's the only criterion, like how things are under the light of nous is the only criterion we take when acting or doing something. So those are, as it were, the four purificatory versions of it and of the virtues. And um, but then he got into the question about, well, is then if this virtue is separation from the body, well, but nous is itself just separate from body. Is it virtue then? And then he says no, because the state of being always governed by intellect is something that we achieve, and also our intellection is, as it were, an activity of the soul that it can or can like that has a choice to act or not. And whereas for nous, it's its nature, right, to make itself known. And these two things are related, and this is how it ends. It's related as speech is to thought, right? So the virtue of the soul is, as it were, an echo, an expression of nous, but nous is not virtue, right? So it ends with as speech is the echo of thought in the soul, so thought in the soul is an echo from elsewhere. That is to say, as the uttered thought is an image of soul thought, so the soul thought image is a thought above itself and is the interpreter of the higher sphere. Virtue, in the same way, is a thing of the soul. It does not belong to the intellectual principle or to what is beyond it, or or to the transcendence, and not to the good itself. Okay, so that was last class. We up to speed? Are there further
Yeah,
anything
I
in?
think I
Okay.
think that's correct. Just a general thing that popped into my mind. The the Jonathan Haidt theory of like the five or seven kinds of morality or something like that, where he has the liberal and conservative debate, like debate rooted in the question if there's any virtue beyond fairness and not doing harm or something like that. And then he has these lists of other things that conservatives consider virtue, like loyalty and purity was one of them.
Okay.
Um, I don't, there's more, I forgot what they are. But
Yeah.
maybe I mean, here Plato has this interpretation of what purity really is,
Right.
but it seems like there's like according to standard, like all kind of modern theories of ethics, there isn't any way to have anything besides for some kind of fairness or minimizing harm or pleasure or something like that.
Mm.
And it's very traditional to have like virtue which don't really make sense. Like maybe Plato himself has a problem with that. Like, what is wrong with someone whose ancestor did something bad? Like there's a blood guilt. Like how does that make my soul worse or something? And then makes a reinterpretation of that somehow and seems to, yes, leave the like traditional way away on the side. Like it's not really it's not really an interpretation of that. It's more like a what we called it, a reclaiming of it or something, right?
Right. Yeah, like a reappropriation.
Yeah,
Right. And we saw that Plato has other problems with the traditional view, like some seems to imply that you can buy off the gods.
right.
Right. But there's one way of understanding Plato's view, which is it's not enough just to do the sacrifice. It's not enough for you to just, as it were, buy off the gods. If you don't separate yourself from the body, you're still vulnerable to, these bad things happening to you and so on. Um, but so I mean that would be like a Platonist who wanted to still hold on to the old belief. Of course, what Plato himself thought is unclear because, after all, dialogues. But like there are later Platonists like Proclus. Proclus quite clearly believes that quite clearly believes in the Platonic idea of what purity is, and also that there's inherited guilt. He thinks that both things are. And so like one way to have to hold both is to say, it's only the Platonic kind of purity that's true purity that's going to get you away from inherited guilt. Right? Um, so that's one way. But in contemporary philosophy, I've seen one philosopher discuss, purity as a virtue and pollution as a problem, and it's in the connection of what's called the dirty hands problem, right? It's especially in political philosophy. It's this thing about it seems that in order to achieve the common good, you have to do some bad things, right? Things that people would not approve. Um, and also it's kind of expected. People expect their politicians to be efficacious, right? If they have a politician who's morally good, but he can't really change anything in society, it's like people say like, well, why did we vote for him, or why is he in power? And so he's expected actually to make these moral compromises in order to, promote the common good. And so this, creates a problem. There like people debate, is it really bad if if there was no real alternative, or is it or maybe some people say that it isn't, some people say that it is, and it was one philosopher, Stephen Devige, who defends that it is bad, and that but we can only make sense of this if we recover an idea of pollution, right? And anyway, there are like many real
I
world
see.
examples of this. Like in Germany in the year 2000s, there was a guy who only managed to find someone who was kidnapped because he tortured the kidnapper, and then afterwards he gave himself up to the police. He was a police officer. He gave himself up to the police because he said, "Look, I tortured this guy to find out." And so,
Mm.
um,
Uh, okay, I
So,
see.
yeah, so just that's like a context that nowadays pollution comes up, right? So,
Right, and but in the terms of traditional things, like I think I was thinking of another way that people might um, reconcile these things is by thinking of, I mean, using the Platonic kind of way of thinking as primary and saying something like, okay, but maybe like I think in the Jewish interpretations, people tend to say things like this. We have all these like laws of ritual purity, which nobody follows anymore. But anyways, um, we have excuses because there's no temple and stuff. But and like it gets interpreted to say like, well, think of it like this: like all these impure things have to do with death or some kind of bodily excretions, which are a kind of death. So it turns out it's all back to saying that the body is bad because it's associated with the part of the human that dies and so on. And then we could sort of interpret like, yeah, that corpse is uh, like impure because it's a body without a soul or something like that.
right. And so the idea is then saying, well, actually, so if you study the impurity laws, you find out that the Platonic conception of purity is actually the true interpretation.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah,
know if it would work for that. Yeah, it would something like that.
something like that.
Maybe you could do that
Yeah,
for these kind of blood, like I don't know if your ancestors, if you killed someone or something. So somehow, I don't know, goes back to some
right,
injustice, but then I mean,
right.
it still doesn't work in a lot in a rational way. Sort of like we still don't explain like why touching it or something like that makes you impure. But
Right. Um, yeah. And I mean, but also like there are then, levels of there's also, in interpreting these preoccupations with blood guilt, for instance, and so on. There are ways of thinking about that just have to do with ordinary justice, just saying if you benefit from it in some way, that's still an ongoing injustice, so you have to like
right,
pay back, or. So there's like an outstanding debt, right? And so that doesn't involve some, but that would take us to another.
right. But then we get back to the problem that having a sacrifice or something doesn't help, or maybe makes things worse because like
Right. Yeah.
you just kill an innocent animal or something, or
Yeah. So let's go now to four. I think we can read four and five today. For background, we don't have much. So just a few passages from the Republic. And so in four and five, he is going to be talking about Like, is purity enough, or is there something beyond purity? And this something beyond is turning to the good, turning to what is good. Right. So if, besides getting clean, you also have to, as it were, turn to or approach the good. Like they're two different, are there two different things, or is it just one thing? But both this idea but this idea from turning comes really crucially from the Republic and its account. So first of all, it shows up originally here in the analogy of the sun, right? That the sun is like the good and so on, and it makes and seeing things in sunlight is like having insights about intelligible things. And here he makes the point that the soul, or at least its capacity to know, is something that is like the good, right? So you know that when we turn our eyes to things whose colors are no longer illuminated by the light of day, but by night lights, the eyes are dimmed and seem nearly blind, as if clear vision were no longer in them. Of course. Yet whenever one turns them on things illuminated by the sun, they see clearly, and vision appears in those very same eyes. Indeed. So here we already have this metaphor of turning your attention, and also the fact that the soul has the ability to uh, turn either to dark things or to light things, right? Either to like the perceptible world or the intelligible. Well, understand the soul in the same way. When it focuses on something illuminated by truth and what is, it understands, knows, and apparently possesses understanding. When it focuses on what is mixed with obscurity and what comes to be and pass away, it opines and is dim, changes its opinions this way and that, and seems bereft of understanding. It does seem that way. So that what gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower is the form of the good. And though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also an object of knowledge. Both knowledge and truth are beautiful things, but the good is other and more beautiful than they. In the visible realm, light and sight are rightly considered sunlight, but it is wrong to think that they are the sun. So here it is right to think of knowledge and truth as good light, but wrong to think that either of them is the good, for the good is yet more prized. This, of course, has a problematic passage for the Neoplatonist, emphasizing how the form of the good is an object of knowledge. Right. So they always have to relativize that somehow. They want to say the form of the good here is the one, which is beyond knowledge, and so on. But what's going to be important for Plotinus now, and reflecting about whether purity is enough, is this image of this whole turning, like it can turn eyes, and also the idea that you because it can turn, it's not the source of light, it's not good, but it is good light. And he'll use exactly this word, good light. And this good word, good like, is a coinage of Plato's, agatho eides. I think we discussed this a bit when we were talking about Proclus. He also used this agatho eides, this construction in something of when he was discussing the myths, but I forget exactly what. And so this is in the end of book six with the line and the sun, and it follows, of course, the allegory of the cave with going down and turning the person, and so that's where you get this Platonic idea that education is just turning people to the right direction, right? So that's what we're gonna look at now. But our present discussion, on the other hand, shows that the power to learn is present in everyone's soul, and that the instrument with which each learns is like an eye that cannot be turned around from darkness to light without turning the whole body. This instrument cannot be turned around from what is coming into being without turning the whole soul until it is able to study that which is and the brightest thing that is, namely the one we call the good. Isn't that right? Yes. Then education is the craft concerned with doing this very thing, this turning around, and with how the soul can most easily and effectively be made to do it. It isn't the craft of putting sight into the soul. Education takes for granted that sight is there, but that it isn't turned the right way or looking where it ought to look, and it tries to redirect it appropriately. right? So this whole idea that education and so more and of course the point here is moral education is turning people in the right direction, and that but they have innately, as it were, this capacity to see. It's just not aimed properly. And this is the immediate continuation. So now it looks as though the other so-called virtues. So again, this is a passage where Plato's distinguishing between true virtue and so-called virtue. And so it's implying that there is, as it were, different levels of virtue. So it's important for this whole idea of scales of virtue. Now it looks as though the other so-called virtues of the soul are akin to those of the body, but they really aren't there beforehand, but are added later by habit and practice. However, the virtue of reason seems to belong above all to something more divine, which never loses its power, but is either useful or beneficial, or useless and harmful, depending on the way it is turned. Or have you never noticed this about people who are said to be vicious but clever? How keen the vision of their little souls is, and how sharply it distinguishes the things it is turned towards. This shows that its sight isn't inferior, but rather is forced to serve evil ends. So the sharper it sees, the more evil it accomplishes. Absolutely. However, if a nature of this sort had been hammered at from childhood and freed from the bonds of kinship with becoming, which have been fastened to it by feasting, greed, and other such pleasures, and which, like leaden weights, pulls its vision downward. So, very Phaedrus Phaedo image here of the soul bound to the body has to release it through asceticism. If being rid of these, it turned to look at true things, and I say at the same that the same soul, the same person, would see these most sharply, just as it now does the things it is presently turned towards. So that's uh, the background from the Republic, and that should give us what's necessary to follow the argument in 4 and 5.
Okay. So should I read?
Please.
So, chapter 4. We come so to the question whether purification is the whole of this human quality, virtue, or merely the forerunner upon which virtue follows. So that's one question. Does virtue imply the achieved state of purification, or does the mere process suffice to it? Virtue being something of less perfection than the accomplished pureness, which is always the term.
Right. This is so right. There is two questions here. The one is purification all of virtue, or is there something more? And there's another question, which is when we talk about purification, are we talking about the being pure or the be or purifying yourself? Then there's this confusing thing at the end, virtue being something of less perfection than the accomplished pureness, which is almost a term. This is because the Greek text itself is weird. And the editors, so McKenna was not working from the critical edition we have. So the editors think that there's something lacking. Some words have been omitted. So just to give you an example of um, how the Gerson translation has it, it has the two questions, but then it has an extra thing saying uh, whether just explaining the second question, whether the virtue lies in the process of being purified or in the state one is in once one has been purified, right? Um, and then he says virtue in the process of being purified would be less complete than the state one is in once having been purified. For having been purified is in a way already a completion. That's this completion is what is the term here, right? So it's just emphasizing the distinction between the process and the end. Um, this might also remind you, it's a distinction I've mentioned before, but maybe not recently, of the distinction that Aristotle makes between changes and activities, right? So a change is something that you can never say that it's happened when it's happening. So like you are either building the house or it's been built, right? But it's not building and built at the same time. So that makes it a change. But activities are things that you say are happening and have happened at once. So I am seeing something and I've seen it, right? So purification is clearly a change in that sense. And for what follows, it's important that that's distinct from seeing and also from understanding, right? From having an insight. And when you're understanding something, you're both doing the activity and it's already realized.
Or that's what his question assumes. That they're
Right.
asking,
His
like, are we
question.
speaking of the becoming pure or of the being pure?
Right. Okay.
Okay.
So you can continue.
Okay, so those are the like base so that's another question. So like one question is this yeah, I don't know. They're not related with these two questions.
Well,
Or like first it would be the becoming pure and then the being pure and then maybe there's a third thing. Those are like the way
exactly.
it would be organized.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, to have been purified is to have cleansed away everything alien. But goodness is something more. So this is like a definition. Since to have been or to be already purified is just a way of saying not uh, having anything that doesn't belong there. That doesn't not the same thing as goodness. Now, if before the impurity entered there was goodness, then the cleaning suffices. Okay, so if we would have a theory that says something like the soul is by itself good, it only becomes not good by association with these impurities, then you can have becoming good and becoming pure meaning the same thing. But even so, not the act of cleansing, but the cleansed thing that emerges will be the good. And it remains to establish what, in the case of the cleansed soul, this emergent is. So even if we would have that, it wouldn't be the it's still right, this is like going back to the second question. We still can't identify being good with being purified or with becoming purified with purifying because that's just a way of saying taking away everything that doesn't belong, but we still don't know what it is that does belong or what
Right.
the cleansed soul is and like what does it mean for it to be good basically.
Mhm.
So it can scarcely prove to be the good. The absolute, so, okay, then going back to Platonic assumption, the absolute good cannot be thought to have taken up its abode with evil. We can think of it only as something of the nature of the good, but paying a double allegiance and unable to rest in the authentic good. So this is
Right.
going back to like an option which, and there's many people that think things like this, like if you have these like all kind of searching for authenticity kind of thoughts, which basically assume that the good or the highest good they can think of is just whatever the soul is. The only problems or the only evil that can be is being mixed with things that you are not. And then well, not the act of purification, but the purified soul would be the good. But he can't have that because, according to him, whatever is the good, with a capital G or whatever, can't be, could never have been become bad or something like that. Could never have been mixed. So if there's something that was at least subject to a process of being confused, then it obviously isn't the good.
Right. This isn't so much a Platonic assumption, but it's something that's like Stoics hold this too. So the idea is that if something is good, then under or is, the good, it can't in any situation, be the cause of bad things, right? Which is why the Stoics end up saying that what's good is only virtue, because everything else, if you don't have virtue, is can be bad, right? And um and then so it's a bit more. It doesn't of course, the capitalization here is entirely the translators, right?
Hmm.
And um, and so yeah, um, So here is where the agathoides, the good like, comes in. So that's this the nature of the good. Something of the nature of the good here is translates that expression. And this paying a double allegiance, right? That's in a less heavy translation is it would be something uh, like being capable of both, right? Um, the
Nice.
so it's that's so that's the thing, and it's what we talked about how the soul, it can focus on one thing, can focus on the good things, on the intelligible things, or it can focus on bodies and what comes to be, and so on. So it has this capacity for both, and therefore it's not intrinsically good, right? And if it's not intrinsically good, then it's not enough for you to just wipe off the things. Right?
Because
This
because something like it would still be empty. Like what would happen if it would only be one? Like there's that impossible. Like
well, the thing is, so if you could um if you just separated it. So this is actually a bit like this reminds one of his argument against Stoics. So the Stoics tell you to separate, right? They tell you to flee the crowd, to think about yourself, and to only, know what's in your power, and not to and to have apathy, which means that the pleasures and pains shouldn't be actually guides to what's good and bad, right? The only thing that's good is virtue, and you should follow that. So they have all this, but so they can they have this whole program of separating you from pleasures and the body and so on. But then you have nothing to turn to, right? Like if you just separate, then what are you going to do? Are you going to and Plotinus's view is that you're just going to end up going back to the body because you have nothing. So like the Stoics, what do they do? The wise man, he does physics, and so he studies how thing, but physical things are destroying each other and are suffering passions all the time. And so you take as your model still the this world of that's subject to passions, and so you're going to fall back into it. So that's the so there's nothing without a um something to explain the goodness, let's say there's not going to be any guarantee of the soul's goodness after purification. I guess uh, that's the view that the what this lacks is it's like also you're talking about authenticity. Some people say the important thing is to be authentic and be true to yourself, um, overcome external pressures and conventions and so on, and you will be good. But actually, if you don't presume that the soul is in itself good, right, then there's going to be there's nothing that's going to guarantee that once you've purified yourself, you don't, become bad. Right. Another way of and but why do you think that the soul isn't in itself good? Well, here it says, oh, it took up its abode with evil. And in the background there's, the soul decided to live in a body. But more generally, it's like we see people doing uh bad things, unjust things, robbing, stealing, cheating, lying, and it's sufficient to think that the soul is somehow implicated in this for you to then say, well, the soul by nature isn't necessarily good. Right? Because for you to insist that, the soul is per se good, even when, people are running around stealing, lying, and so on, you have to then say, well, everything, all this bad stuff these people are doing, none of it comes from the soul. It all comes from foreign things. Um, and and right, and that's not um Plotinus's view. and I guess that's connected with the idea that, the soul is the self-moving agent behind these living beings, and as the agent, it is responsible for what they do. Um, so so that's why um, we can't think that the soul is per se good, right? Goodness needs a further explanation than just the soul. Um, is that enough?
Um, yeah, just that then we're missing like why is it like why is this purification at all good? Meaning to say, what you just said was that well,
Ah,
the soul is just whatever does whoever the agent that does everything that you do, and of course you did bad things, so why would you even think that you are good unless you have like right? But you were the one that came up with that theory, like the fatal theory, like the soul is just life, and therefore dying isn't the soul dying. And in some way, the same idea goes for like all the good things. Like the soul is what's responsible for good things, and bad things are not its responsibility. I mean, that's the Platonic theory.
right. But I mean, like the Phaedo theory, everyone dies. So the soul, every soul gets free from the body, but some souls keep coming back, um, and keep coming back for more. So, I mean, that in some sense shows that, there's more purification is needed so it's not enough for you to be separated from the body. You have to separate yourself from the body, right? And it's because otherwise you'll just, keep being reborn as different animals, or you will become a ghost and haunt your grave, and things like that. You'll bother your former lovers to, give you a proper burial and things like that. Um, you but then you ask, well, why is the purification needed at all? Um, well, it is, even if s- hmm, even if separating from the bad isn't immediately, or um, th it's not two things. First of all, what he's arguing here is just that the act of cleansing by itself is what makes us good, right? So it's open to the view, which is ultimately the view that he'll take, which is that the act of cleansing isn't what makes us good, but when we clean, something else happens. We do something else as well, which is turn towards the good, which is a positive thing, and that is and that is what actually assures that we're good. Um, so it's like it's a conceptual question here about um, whether the act of cleansing suffices. Right? And the the other thing is that, like, it could be that purification is an even if it's not a sufficient condition for goodness, it could be a necessary condition. So even though, once we've separated from the body, once we die, we can be reborn again as other animals, or once we've been good Stoics and turned to ourselves and learned to control our emotions and so on, we're still open to, like, just decide to invest in the world again. Then um, that doesn't mean that although that retraction, that pulling away isn't enough to make us good, it can be necessary, right? It can be that as long as we're involved with our passions and the things in the world, we will actually we'll never notice that the particular things in our lives are actually just images of higher patterns, and that it's these higher patterns, these universal patterns that we have to pay attention to, and so on. Because we're always just concerned about the next thing, the next thing, and the next thing. Um, So so there are reasons to think that it's still a necessary condition, even if it's not a sufficient condition. And also, even if it's if it's not a sufficient condition, um, it doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily imply that what we're going to have is a real two-step theory where you first separate yourself and then you do something else. It could be that there are two things that happen at once.
Okay. Right. I guess I mean, in some sense, like, like the problem I'm having is that his question only makes sense after his answer, or something like the you can't have like if purification is to mean anything, or maybe his argument is that it doesn't really mean anything without like replacing the context. Like someone could say, well, I mean, is fasting or like some kind of asceticism good? Like, well, I don't know. Well, I mean, you could say something like what asceticism obviously is a kind of focusing, like it frees you
Mhm.
from, being busy with a lot of things. But if someone is fasting in order to, go on planned killing a bunch of people, there's nothing good about that. Um, Not even in like like in a Platonic sense, where like, well, he is less. No, he's not anything less. He's not less in his body. He's just not, he's just busy doing one thing and not another thing. Um, so it turns out all these speeches that we gave about, fasting, let's say, were not really, didn't really mean that. We only meant that after we had this conception of what is good, which is also not, just eating, and then we could say that. Or is that just what he's saying? But then you lose the whole idea of purification as a thing. We might as well just say become good.
Right. Well, uh, yeah, I mean, one way of looking at what he's saying is to saying, analyzing the parts of what we mean when we say, flee this world and become God, and become like God, right? And um, and so, you know, working, having social virtues, that can't be all of it, right? Because that's not really fleeing the world at all. Um, Purifying yourself, okay, that's more than the political virtues, but it's still not enough. And but so it could be that one way to maybe solve your concern is to present him just as analyzing this general project of becoming good and its elements, and not necessarily building one level on top of another.
Hmm. But it does seem like there is some sense in which the soul is by itself good, or at least something we could say something like this. Like the body or like wherever social virtues live cannot be good. It can be
Mm,
only good as a pattern or as having a measure or something like that, but not as being
right.
itself good. While the soul, which is the thing we're trying to like reveal, or how do you call it? Something like make emerge or whatever, like
Hmm.
make like uncover in this purification is something that at least can be good. It isn't good, but it can like have it can be turned toward the intellect. And
Right.
that is
And
then
and, and that
it is like another step, and it is like a concession that the soul is good, but not like that's exactly what he said. It's good, but not the good, or it can be. We end up with these
right.
like three levels that way.
Yeah, it has something with the nature of good, but it's not good per se yet. Okay.
Hmm.
Um,
So then you would say something like, not sure in my example, but like the person that is ascetic for, I don't know, let's say just for artistic reasons or something, that he does have the nature of being good because now he has like the tool or something that can be turned towards intellect, although he's still not a good Platonist.
right. So like the person who's just aesthetic for to be an artist or to be evil, that's kind of like the person that Socrates was talking about in the Republic, who's very clever, but who's because he's so clever, he's that much worse. Right. Um, okay, so read the next passage. I'll have something to say about the text and then we can discuss it.
Okay. So here we are. It can scarcely, we did this. The soul's true good is in devotion to the intellectual principle. Its kin. Evil to the soul lies in frequenting strangers. See, I do like this imagery. There is no other way for it. There is no other way for it than to purify itself and so enter into relation with its own. The new phase begins by a new orientation.
Okay. So here he doesn't on the paragraph here he introduces the idea of an orientation of turning towards, right? So that's like the extra thing beyond purification that he's going to talk about. But
Mhm.
before that, translator has gone overboard a bit, and it says the soul's true good is in a devotion to the intellectual principle, its kin. Evil to the soul lies in frequenting strangers. That's a bit of an exaggeration. So the intellect isn't mentioned here. Um, what is mentioned is just that the good of the soul is being with what is akin to it, right? And the evil is being with the opposite. So I mean, it's of course not a um, it's not a Platonic stretch to say the things like the soul are the is the intellect, right? You can think of the affinity argument in the Phaedo. One of the arguments for the immortality of the soul is that it has an affinity, so it is kin to the forms, right? And so that's one way of filling that out, the things that are akin to it. And also this being with, he translated as devotion, but being with can just be having company, and it's a common metaphor that Plato uses for knowledge of the forms, right? Where sometimes he'll even use this word sun einai. You know, there's a noun form of it, sun uzia, which can be being with someone in the sense of sleeping with them. And so he uses this as a metaphor of, communion with the forms. Um, so um, And so this at first can seem, what he says here can first seem to be just re, saying what he just rejected, because it says, oh, so it's and that's maybe why the translator, went overboard and included the intellect. Because if you just say the soul's good is in being with what's like it, and evil is in strangers, it seems, oh, you're saying that all we have to do is purify ourselves. We just have to be with what's like it.
Mhm.
Um, but the key here is that what's like it is not it. Um, it needs rather to be purified so as to be with it, those things. The enter into relation is that same sun einai that he translated as devotion. And then he says but that being in a relation with these other things that are like it are requires turning, requires a new orientation, right? And and so that's the thing. So it's not enough for you to turn away from bodies, for you to turn away from the dark things, from the passions. Stop paying attention to pleasure and pain as guides of what is good and bad. You need to turn towards something that is like you, right? Um, why uh, why the emphasis on likeness or familiarity, affinity to goodness? It, I mean, uh, there's like a tautological way of thinking about that. Just that what's good for something, it's what is like it, right? In general, you can think that way. So things are benefited by the things that they are like. Um, but in the case of the soul, it can be the idea, right? It's not enough for it to be alone. It has to have something to occupy itself with. Um, the Or of course, if you supply what's like it with Nous or the forms, then of course it follows quite clearly from
Mm.
Platonic principles.
But the basic thought here is something like the soul is its good is not being itself, or like if you like just have the like levels here, then it means something like it's not in itself, but in its being like the higher thing, which is another way of saying that the purification, or no, the purification is just this all sort of concentrating to itself, but its good is in its focusing or turning to the higher thing. And in some case, in some sense, you'd say something like, so what belongs to the soul is only the turning, but not the good.
Right. You can, yeah. But what bothers me is that the affinity doesn't imply higher. So it could be just, turning towards other souls. But I guess of course, as a as an explanation, you might think that, well, that's not enough because then, well, why are those other souls good? And so you could, just push it and say, well, it has to be something that is not just like, but maybe is the source of likeness. Not, it can't be res- um, horizontal likeness. A is like B, B is like A. It has to be towards the vertical. Right? So maybe that's the idea. It has to turn towards its original in some sense. Yeah.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Okay.
Ah, or another option, since the soul is capable of good, it is like the good in some way, so it is an image of the good. And so that's why you say that it has to turn towards what is like it, right? Which would be the good, or what it is like, rather, convert.
Mhm. Now, then after the purification, then there is still this orientation to be made. No, by the purification, the true alignment stands accomplished. The soul's virtue then is this alignment? No, it is what the alignment brings about within. And this is that it sees that, like sight affected by the thing seen, the soul admits the imprint, graven upon it and working within it of the vision that has come to.
Right. So this is what I meant when I said, the two processes might happen at the same time. So qua purification is not enough. But it is true that when you purify yourself, you automatically are turning towards the forms. Um, so so right, so like the person who becomes ascetic because he's concentrating all his strength to kill someone. That person hasn't properly purified themselves. They've just turned to one, you passion instead of overcoming their passions. That's how Plotinus would see it. So um, you, but it is true that, so it's not enough that you're separating yourself from something, you're also turning towards this sight, this thing that is um, uh, that it's seeing. But uh, and this will change it in some way, right? What it's the same way that what is seen makes an imprint, an image on our eyes or on our soul. So like the eye in some sense, or our capacity for seeing becomes like what we see, reproduces its colors and shape and so on. So also that thing that the soul contemplates will change the soul.
Hmm.
Um, but then there's a question of that it turns to, which is, wait, but where have these things been all along that the soul is
Okay,
turning to?
right. So now, so let me, um, where am I? But was not the soul possessed of this, of all this always, or had it forgotten? Um, what it now sees. So forgetting is like the Mino thing, really. Which says something like the forms were in the soul, or the soul was in the forms, and it just forgot by living here.
Right.
Um,
Before we were born, we contemplated everything, then we forgot.
mhm. What it now sees, it certainly always possessed, but as lying away in the dark, not as acting within it. To dispel the darkness and thus come to the knowledge of its inner content, it must thrust toward the light. So that is one answer. Something like it did, well, it doesn't really answer. Um, it did
Well, I
always
mean,
possess it, but not acting, something like potentially, I don't know. And therefore, we need to have this purification, which turns out to not only be purification, it turns out to also be a what it says thrusting towards or turning towards the
right.
light.
So to um right, the idea is um we always had these things that it well, he's going to explain it in more detail in a bit, but the idea is, yeah, it was potential, but it wasn't active, right? And this turning towards is turning towards something that makes it active, thrusting towards the light. And but there's something that's a bit there's what the analogy with moving towards the light doesn't really make, which is it's not just that you move from a dark place to a light place, but rather when you move to the light, the things in you become luminous, the things in you become active, right? So it's uh, so because noesis, insight is always active. It's something that comes from us. It's not passive like perception. So the purification and turning around is not just stopping to busy ourselves with the things that we know just through uh, passively, through perception and passions, right? But it's also um, turning to, or so initiating a relation with, or being in a relationship with something that starts making us have insight. So starts making us know things through ourselves.
Hmm.
Okay. And he's going to explain a bit more about how it can be, in what sense it was potentially there already in the next.
Okay, so let's see. Um, Let me go back here. Sorry. So, besides, okay, but possessed. So, okay, so number one, it's not always there in full, actually, of course not. And also needs this turning towards. It's not enough to have the uh, purification. Besides, it possessed not the originals, but images, pictures. And those it must bring into closer accord with the verities they represent. So, since, well, it's never going to have more than pictures, but I don't know, somehow it needs to make the pictures be pictures of something. I don't know.
Right. So it had what it had was it had as it yeah images. The word it uses here and also in the previous one, all this in the previous paragraph when it talked about the sight is affected by the thing seen is typos, which means imprint. Um, and um, so the idea is that so it had images of the forms in it, and what it needs to do is, which are, as it were, they are the products of some kind of activity of Nous on it, but it has to, as it were, and the bring it into closer chords, use efharmosein, which is a word that you use for um, measurement, which is like when you put a ruler against something, you say, oh, it fits, right? And so here it's like this is an imprint, like this is the letter A written on a paper. I bring it to uh, to the A in the mechanical printer. And I say, aha, it fits. And so this is um the as it were image he gives us
Mm.
to. I mean, to connect that with what I was saying about how the inner things are not just illuminated, but they're made luminous in us. So it's that these what we had in us were, as it were, this knowledge of the forms, and by being in connection with Nous, with as it were knowledge that exists separately, um, this knowledge begins to be active in us as well. So there's a this relationship of affinity or similarity.
All right, and like there's like so, but there's like an interesting step, which is like something like checking the copy that it fits to the original, or like bringing, which is like, I don't know how to understand that.
Yeah, so by bringing the copy into relationship with the original, that copy itself becomes active. So it becomes, it could then imprint other things, presumably.
Mm.
Um, and um, and so there's as it were a this is going to be like clearer uh um in the next chapter, but it's as it were there's like this shift in perspective because at first you think, okay, yeah, we're talking about the soul that's purifying itself, and then it turns towards Nous, turns towards the forms, starts having these insights. But since this having insights means that you yourself start producing knowledge, then
Mm-hmm.
it's like you're no longer in the position of the um, of the illuminated thing, the passive thing. You move, as it were, to the perspective of the thing that shines. You become a shining thing. So it's as if, um, someone goes and learns the teacher for a long time, and eventually they start to think like the teacher. And then they think of themselves as they were. They look at their previous self as the teacher looking to them. So as it were, they shifted points of view, right? And there's a similar thing here of shifting points of view, where we're going to see that the soul moves from being this thing that so this agent that's primarily concerned with the body, and then with separating itself from the body, and um, and then it's going to shift to seeing itself as something separate that has this body soul composite to take care of.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, as if by looking at someone's eyes, we could, as it were, project ourselves into their point of view looking at us. Um,
And that is like the difference between just being a person who was born with these images and being a philosopher.
right. Yeah. So yeah, everyone has the capacity to look and so on, and we all have this image of news in us, these innate concepts that allow us to navigate the world and things like that. But the philosophers somehow managed to take up the perspective of the source of all these of all these ordered things.
Hmm.
Um, so and that's a bit about like the also text tells us is a bit about what purification is not enough. So these things were potential. So it's not enough for you to remove the obstruction, the thing that keeps it from acting, you also need some cause that makes it act, right? Um, so, for instance, if someone is uh, is too hot, it's not enough to um, take away what's keeping them from cooling themselves down. You have to actually put them in touch with something that actually cools them, right? And the two processes can happen together, as he says. By the purification, the true alignment stands accomplished, but there's still a conceptual distinction to be made. Right?
Hmm. Well, it seems like you have to do something else. Like you have to something like you can't.
You have
Um,
to be doing something else. So you can't just be concentrated on becoming authentic. You have to be concentrated on becoming good, on
right,
knowing
or the process is additive, not subtractive.
right,
Like uh, it's not only the authentic. Like there's many sort of mystical traditions that present the entire process as subtractive.
right.
Um,
Um, yeah, and for Plotinus, it wouldn't just be subtractive. Um,
and further, so did I finish? And further, of the intellectual principle is said to be a possession of the soul. That is only in the sense that it is not alien, and that the link becomes very close when the soul side is turned towards it. Otherwise, ever present though it be, it remains foreign. Just as our knowledge, if it does not determine action, is dead to us.
right. So here I think is like uh, an explanation for, it's kind of like an explanation of why saying that we have these images in us, or so um, and so if we didn't have these images in us, then even though Nous is everywhere, right, it would still not be, it would still not be, it would still be something foreign, right? It would still be something as external to the soul as bodies, right? It isn't external to the soul because we have these images in us. And gives an argument or analogy, says, just as our knowledge, if it does not determine action, is dead to us, in the Greek is if it does not determine action, it is also alien. And the idea is, I think the idea is that does not determine action can also be something like does not determine the whole of us. In the other translation, it says, for even areas of scientific understanding in which we are not wholly engaged are alien. And I think he's thinking about arguments about why medicine or engineering, for instance, can't be the highest good. Why not? Well, because you can use medicine to make poisons, and you can use engineering to produce traps and war machines. Um, so, and just as an area uh, of knowledge can be alien to us because it's it doesn't it doesn't speak to the whole of us, right? To what we are. We can be indifferent to it, or it can have opposite effects. So also Nous would be like that if we didn't have these images of Nous in us, right? You could think of, um, and that is the sense in which we have Nous. Um, and uh, right, and the right. Tachade achai hutu legetai echein. um, let me just, it's just this very close, which is bothering me a bit all of a sudden. Um, it's not that it's very close, it's that it is not alien. Yeah. Um, it is not alien, and it is especially not alien when the soul's sight is turned toward it.
Hmm.
Um, so I guess this is what's he arguing? Oh, well, I guess he's arguing against the view that says, well, if it's just intellect, but intellect is part of the soul, and so it's also so the goodness is in the soul. And he's saying, no, the goodness, the intellect is soul has intellect only in the sense that it is like it, but not in the sense that it has it as a part of it or something like that. So that you could say all you need to do is purify yourself again.
And this likeness is the same thing as saying it has the images and not the sort of connection to their source or something.
Right. So an image by nature, I mean, so an image, you can say that by nature it wants to be connected to its source. So let's think of a no, this is even kind of a an Epicurean example. So you think of a mask, right? It's like a mask of my face that fits exactly my face, or mask of your face. So this actually in order to understand what this mask is, you have to understand that it's a mask of Antonia or it's a mask of Yitzchok, right? So there's an inherent reference of this image to its original. However, of course, you can put the mask on other on other people, and you can, as it were, use it to, as it were, classify people as like, oh, okay, this guy looks like a teacher or something, and things like that, or this guy looks Brazilian or something like that. And um, so, so in the same way, we have these images of Nous in us, and they are like Nous, and that's even why we can are capable of turning towards Nous, and why the soul is capable of turning towards Nous. Where, but still they are by themselves their potential and they can be obscured because, for instance, you're using this mask to know different to know bodies and not to following its innate indications of the forms. Um, right.
Mm,
So so that's the right.
um, yeah, so maybe you want to help me with something here.
Sure.
Just to relate this to something else.
Okay.
I'm trying somewhere. So there's like, can we relate this like in like some who was I reading? These like early Renaissance or late Renaissance people, they like have this like very clear like story of there's like being the debate. It's like it gets presented like about the as debate between Averroists and other interpretations of the soul, where Averroes, or maybe it goes back to Alexander of Aphrodisias, said that and that is the soul is only a potential. Um, Turns out to be like a material thing, since potential needs to be a kind of material thing, or at least in matter. And it's only this sort of person that achieves or actualizes his knowledge, which has any kind of separate soul, or in like the religious sense, any hope of, of immortality and stuff like that. And then this gets contrasted with some kind of other view, which is usually said to be the Platonic view, right? What's his name wrote a whole book about this, and other people, which is that the person is born with a soul, or the soul is pre-exists the body, and then okay, those are, and then like people fight about this forever and excommunicate each other and stuff. And so the problem that I have, or like the trying to understand, is it turns out that, I mean, in some sense, this is not a real debate. Or what we're reading here is that there's some, the Platonist view, or at least the Neoplatonist view, is actually very much closer to like this Aristotelian view or whatever Aristotle himself believed, or like this whole debate in the anima, what it means. But because they also have these like what he keeps on saying here, like what Plotinus, for example, keeps on saying here is that don't think that you're born with this, or don't think that it's enough to just become what you are. You need to really, and then he same thing where he keeps on saying like you this the forms in the soul are only potential forms or images or whatever the language is here. It turns out to sort of match to that thought. And there's some difference that I don't know exactly what it is, but does this make
Okay.
sense? Does my
It
question make sense?
The question makes sense, but I do think there's a difference you're overlooking. So yeah, Platonists and Aristotelians will agree that the soul's in somehow in potency, in potential. However, um, how Aristotle describes it in Anima 3:4, 5, especially Anima 3:4, it seems that it has to be absolutely bare of anything. It's like a pure potential that can take on anything. And it's like a completely an empty wax tablet where you can just stamp on it for anything. If there were already forms there, they would, as it were, get in the way of your stamping things, right? And you wouldn't be able to understand. Um, and the Platonists will say it's in potential, it's potential, but it's also actual. It's what Aristotle calls first actuality, but second potentiality. Right? And so it is like there is the child. The child can learn mathematics. And then they learn mathematics. They learn the theorem of Pythagoras, and then they're capable of demonstrating it. And then they are, and then they and then sometimes they are actually demonstrating it. They're doing mathematics, and sometimes they're not capable of demonstrating it because they're drunk, right?
Hmm.
So Aristotle thinks we all start out like the child, as after all, this is what I just presented is what he says. So we start off with this general ability to understand mathematics, to learn mathematics, but we don't actually have mathematical concepts in us already. The Platonists think that we are actually all like drunk mathematicians, and we have to get sober, which is what science is telling you to do here, get sober, and then you'll be able to actually do mathematics. So there's a difference. So they both agree on potentiality, but not what kind of potentiality it is.
Hmm.
So the Aristotelian view of the mind is, as it were, this pure potentiality to receive and understand things. Whereas the Platonist view is this potential structure that can be used to grasp things. But the structure is there. We don't build it.
Right. And then the Aristotle would have a like the question that the Platonist will ask is something like, so who activates the second actuality? And they would like some people would start saying, well, there's this magic agent intellect that does that. Uh,
Right.
and that's
And yeah,
then we
and
get to the same problem. So where's the agent intellect? Is it in your soul or is it somewhere else? And if it's somewhere else, how does it get to you? And so on.
right. And also the Aristotelians would tell this magic story called abstraction,
Okay,
where
that's the other option, right? From the
right,
fantasies that you have and so on.
yeah, from the fancies, and then the Platonists are like, how do you get exact concepts from inexact perceptions and like where does abstraction start from? It's a circle. You already have to have the concept in order to, look at all the instances and things like that. So,
Okay, okay.
right. Yeah.
Okay, so then one more question. So then who are the Platonic children? So like the actual children. Meaning to say, do are literal children actually born with these whatever pictures that we're talking about here? And it does seem that's true. Like Aristotle's description of having to learn math and then getting this is what actually happened in education.
Right. So for the Platonist, yeah, they have all this, but embodiment is an awful thing. embodiment is like getting existentially drunk. And and this has to do with the passage that we saw in uh I mean in the Republic. And the thing is, actually teaching children isn't about getting them, to form totally new things. It's actually, if you just point them in the right direction and, make sure that they don't uh, get into these loops where they just keep doing things that give them pleasure or make them run away, they'll figure this stuff out on their own, right? Because they have this in them. It's just they just have to learn like how to pay attention to it and to find it. It's like Socrates walking through the demonstration of the incommensurability of the diagonal with the slave and the Meno. Right?
Hmm.
That's the
Right.
Platonic view. Right. But um yeah, but that's so they think it's not totally new what comes into the child's mind and all that. Um,
So would you be able to say something like, I mean, if someone like in this like simplest like words presentation where like one person will say, well, you are born with a soul, with the intellectual soul or something like that, and the
Mhm.
other person will say, well, no, you don't, you acquire it. I mean, the Platonic position is something in between, really. Or it's they would rather say you are born with a soul, but they don't mean to say that children have souls. Or I'm just like, is there like language that says that, or is that would that be just the Aristotelian language to speak that way, or not even Aristotle,
well,
but people, other
they
people?
they wouldn't they certainly would not say that, that they don't have. Well, do they have Nous? Right? She's saying intellectual soul, so that's what call Nous. Well, Plotinus would say, well, they have these images in them. It's not Nous itself.
Mm.
Um, the so they might this enters into a different issue about um I mean, yeah, but it's a different issue about personal immortality or achieved immortality. Right. So are you just immortal because you're born, you have a soul, or do you have to do something to become immortal? Like kind of the forms or
Mm.
so. And the Platonists say yes, but like thing is, if you never become a philosopher and you spend your whole life doing, dedicated to business, say, then you'll never actually identify with your soul. And so it's questionable to say that you are immortal, right? You owe your life to this immortal thing that's the true agent behind all your actions, but of course,
You, in the sense of your biography, the life that you've lived this time won't be immortal.
yeah, this identity won't be immortal. But and so in that sense, it can seem that, Platonists think that immortality is achieved. But of course, in another sense, they're very committed to the idea that every single soul is immortal, right? But the thing is that not everyone identifies with their soul, right?
Hmm.
You have to stop being drunk. You have to get sober to do that.
I see.
Um, and the case with the children is, yeah, so their life
Oh,
and
children that die don't go to heaven. That
well, they're
or that one, like your child. Like people have very often want to know, like if they have a child that dies or something like that.
right. Well, I mean, of course, there's the cool thing of like going to heaven is not a
Yeah, whatever.
but
I
but
mean,
but yeah, I mean, yeah, the child that dies, the soul probably will, didn't really get a chance to do much to develop any good habits or any bad habits. So it's probably just gonna like start over in a similar situation again. Of course, it could be that I mean, I guess who knows what it's like to die as a child, right? I mean, and what kind of impact that has on a soul. So,
hmm,
but um, but basically, it's not enough for it to really change its character or something, probably.
right.
Um,
I see.
okay.
Like the problem that I was having is because the Zohar seems to very much like the language of people achieving their souls.
Uh,
But then I think get stuck, or at least people later get stuck because would be very hard to identify it with a real Averroist position where you don't not really born with any soul. I mean, you can't have reincarnation that way. None of the
right.
things work.
I mean, the Averroes position is weird in a lot of ways. Um, but of course, I mean, it has some things, it's trying to explain some real things. So it's trying to explain how can you and I understand the same thing? And if we come to understand the same thing, we have to had this, as it were, shared potentiality. So that's why there's only one passive intellect, uh, and things like that. Um, so I mean, there are problems, and uh, yeah, and like we have a Averroist ways of talking. Like when we say we now know something that some scientists in Munich figured out, and we say it, we, meaning all of mankind, now knows. And of course, so that's like this conception that there's like this one body of human knowledge, right? Which is, if you're going to take that metaphysically seriously, that's like the Averroist view. And it's a part of Dante's argument for why there has to be a world empire, because only that will allow this common body of knowledge to be completely actualized someday. Um, and otherwise, we'll just keep getting into wars, and then we'll
Yeah.
never realize human nature.
Yeah, but
Uh,
that's just like an implication that happens from these thoughts. But like, I'm just
yeah,
focused on the like thing, like we say something like children don't have soul. Like you don't have a soul until you become a philosopher or something like that, which is
right.
not. It sounds like it would emphasize how important it is to become a philosopher at the expense of not being very accurate.
Right. So like, yeah, but it's theory developed to explain how philosophers can talk to each other, how scientists can learn from each other. And it's not and so it wasn't developed to explain children. It was and so
Or
so
to
that's why
educate children, really. It's not very good
yeah,
for education.
yeah. So that's why so that's also like a bit why this theory seems like doesn't really work well here. But it's like the origins, the motivations are somewhere else.
Hmm.
Next week, same time?
Okay, I see. Okay. And I guess, yeah, shouldn't be any issues.
Right. Okay. So have a good
All right,
week.
have a good week. Okay, thank you.